My grandfather grew up in rural Japan in the early part of the 20th century. As you might expect, he had many stories that were pretty horrific, but none scared me more than his encounter with the Gashidokuro. The village he grew up in, as you might expect, was pitch black after dark. There were only about 10 houses in the village, and only one other household had children the same age as him, a brother and sister named Yui and Hiroshi, who he hung out with almost every day when he wasn't working. They would play make-believe in the forest, and other more complex games on the dirt road leading to the village. The house immediately adjacent to my grandfather's was owned by an older bachelor. My grandfather knew him only as Mr. Nakamura. My grandfather's parents didn't trust him. Neither did any of the other adults in the village with young children. He often baked sweets which he walked around offering to children, but he never took it any further than that. And he owned a lot of the good farmland that the village used, so they let it be. My grandfather often described having insomnia as a child, and he would often lie there in bed, waiting for sleep to come into the wee hours of the morning. Not every night, but many nights, my grandfather described having a ringing in his ears. It would build and build over a period of 5 minutes, and it would fill him with dread. It felt like something was coming closer and closer to the outside of his window, and this ringing in his ears was a sixth sense that alerted him to it. Finally, after about 5 minutes, the ringing stopped, abruptly, immediately subsided, and he described the sensation of feeling like something was outside his window, watching him. His parents hung Shinto charms in the window, which would sway around the time the ringing stopped, as though guided by some invisible force. The charms were said to ward off evil spirits, but he had never been told of any that were supposed to roam the area. And in the morning, when the light of day broke and he was able to investigate outside his window, he never found a clue. No trace that anything had been there. But one morning, after a particularly bad episode of ringing, he checked outside the window to find a giant handprint in the mud. It had 4 straight digits and a 5th that curved like a thumb. It was a human handprint, but it was 15 times the size of a normal human hand. My grandfather didn't know what to make of it, and gazed up at the window of Mr. Nakamura's house. The old man was giving him that same creepy smile he always did, and waved with one hand. My grandfather shuddered. It seemed like possibly he was behind this, or he knew something, but he wasn't about to go over there and ask him. Just as the adults, Mr. Nakamura creeped out my grandfather as well. My grandfather was working in a remote part of the fields that day. His father wasn't in earshot. The heat was sweltering, and his hands were bruised and scraped. His toes were wrinkled from sweat and water that had gotten into his boots, and towards the end of the day, when he was just about to pack up and go back home, he looked over the hill to see Mr. Nakamura watching him. He was holding a tray of something, probably more homemade sweets. My grandfather scrambled to pack up, but wasn't fast enough, and Mr. Nakamura made it over to him. "Hey there," he said with a grin. "You've been working hard all day. You deserve a break." My grandfather couldn't figure out how Mr. Nakamura even knew where he was. He was several kilometers away from the village, and again, it wasn't a part of the fields that they tended to often. Fear overtook my grandfather as he realized Mr. Nakamura must have followed him there, and had likely been watching him the whole day. "Oh, no thank you," my grandfather replied, trying to be polite to the offer of sweets. Sugar was the last thing he wanted at the end of a hot day with partial dehydration. Not to mention, he feared what Mr. Nakamura might have put into the sweets. "Oh, no, I insist," Mr. Nakamura said, a little more aggressively. "No, I really don't." Mr. Nakamura grabbed my grandfather's arm. "I insist," he said. My grandfather could tell in that moment, looking into Mr. Nakamura's eyes, that this had been what his facade was trying to hide all these years. He was acting on some deep, animalistic urge. He was abandoning his humanity. My grandfather knew what to do in an instant, and he didn't hesitate to punch Mr. Nakamura in the balls, and sprinted away as he doubled over. My grandfather ran all the way home, but his father hadn't returned yet. He told his mother what happened, and she made a concerned look and sighed. But she knew there was nothing they could really do, as Mr. Nakamura held so much political power in the town. She gave him a small pocket knife to hold on to if anything should happen again, but he doubted it would really help much. As the two of them stood in the kitchen, they heard a tapping on the front window. They both looked over, alarmed, but it was just Yui and Hiroshi out front, waiting to play with him. Most mothers in the modern day probably wouldn't let their child go out and play after what happened, but they were a tougher sort back then. My great-grandmother merely told my grandfather to stay close to the house and be careful. My grandfather told me he felt safe in the company of his friends, and they went to go play hopscotch on the dirt road right beside the house. About half an hour passed, although they all lost track of the time they were having so much fun, and eventually Yui looked around towards my grandfather's house and gasped. "It's Mr. Nakamura," she said. The three of them had discussed previously how uncomfortable he made them, and my grandfather had shared with his friends earlier what had happened. My grandfather looked around towards his house to find that Mr. Nakamura was standing between them and the house. His cheerful expression was nowhere to be seen. It was an angry smirk on his face this time. My grandfather pulled out the small pocket knife that he had been given by my great-grandmother, and Mr. Nakamura smiled and pulled out a larger, paring knife. The three children stood still for a moment, paralyzed in fear, and then ran into the woods when Mr. Nakamura took steps towards them. They screamed, hoping that an adult would hear, but they were already deep enough into the forest that they were out of earshot. The three kids stuck together. It didn't occur to them to split up. Instinctually, they felt that sticking together meant they all had the best chance of survival, as opposed to splitting up and sacrificing one of them. Night fell fast in the hills, and they couldn't see a thing. The three children cowered behind a tree, knowing Mr. Nakamura was here, and occasionally they were able to hear his footsteps on the soil. Deep into the distance, they could hear adults calling for them as the hours passed by, but they were really nothing more than inanimate voices on the wind. When my grandfather could hear Mr. Nakamura's laughing coming uncomfortably close, they bolted again, even deeper into the forest. They kept tripping, calling out to each other and crying in the pitch black as Mr. Nakamura continued to pursue them. And eventually, and although they had no way of knowing, the hour struck midnight. My grandfather recalls looking up at the moon and seeing the silhouettes of the treetops swaying in the breeze, and it was then that he heard that familiar ringing in his ears. He was so exhausted and already so afraid, but a deeper level of fear took him when he heard it. It was like some deep part of his spirit was screaming out to him to flee. All the kids seemed to hear it, and all began shuddering, wailing, and calling out for their parents. Looking up at the silhouettes of the treetops, my grandfather could feel that something was coming as the ringing in his ears got even louder. The trees were being pushed aside by some invisible force, and all three children scattered, running around Mr. Nakamura, who was now the lesser threat, and back into the direction that they believed to be the village. The old man took a swing at my grandfather and grazed his cheek with the paring knife, but otherwise it was a clean getaway. Mr. Nakamura grunted aggressively, panting and running back after them. The ringing in my grandfather's ears was unbearably loud, and then stopped. It was as though time slowed down when he looked around to see Mr. Nakamura chasing behind him. There was a sudden stillness in the air that seemed unnatural, and suddenly the face of a giant skeleton appeared behind the old man. Its head alone was as tall as Mr. Nakamura. Its lower body seemed to fade into the blackness as its upper body reflected the dull light of the moon. The other children ran, but my grandfather couldn't look away. A long skeletal arm with massive hands wrapped around Mr. Nakamura and lifted him into the air. The skull groaned excitedly as Mr. Nakamura screamed in confusion. The skull wasted little time in biting off Mr. Nakamura's head. Aortal blood spurted up into the air, which the skeleton quickly imbibed before discarding Mr. Nakamura's body, flinging it into the forest. My grandfather was frozen still, in fear, as a dull red glow appeared in the skeleton's eye sockets. It opened its mouth wide and began excitedly climbing towards him. My grandfather ran screaming and sprinted straight for the houses. He ran into Yui and Hiroshi, who were already with some adults, and screamed at them to run inside, but the Gashidokuro had already become invisible once again, and everyone assumed he was talking about Mr. Nakamura. He pleaded with everyone to flee, to run indoors. He told them Mr. Nakamura was dead. The other adults were confused, but gradually made their way back to their respective homes. Yui and Hiroshi, their parents, and my grandfather's parents all sat them down in my grandfather's house and interrogated them one at a time on what had happened. My grandfather told them of the skeleton, and although the Gashidokuro was an urban legend, none of them believed him. None of them had ever seen it. And then again began the ringing. They all heard it. They all knew something was coming, and my grandfather ran to his bedroom window. The other children and adults followed close behind. The ringing grew louder and louder, and then stopped, and the Shinto talisman in the window rotated violently. My great-grandfather touched it, and for a moment removed it from the spot where it was hanging on the window. A massive, chattering skull sat 1 foot away from the window, staring into them with its dull, glowing red eyes. Everyone screamed, and my great-grandfather immediately put the talisman back where it had hung. My grandfather said his insomnia got worse for a few months after that, knowing that that thing was what was outside, but he had a newfound respect for the talisman and what it was keeping at bay. Hey guys, thanks for listening to that story. Subscribe and hit the bell to hear more original creepypastas every Thursday, and also tune in on Sunday nights at 9 p.m. Eastern Standard Time for Nightmare Theater, an open book club for nightmares. Until next time, embrace the beautiful dark.